You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 392 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about the protests in Hong Kong. I have updates to what's happening in the Syrian War, and I'm talking about Israel's string of bombings across the Middle East and the signaling of a more aggressive policy towards Iran. All right, everybody, I need you to go to the Libertarian Institute and take the time to share the show or recommend it to somebody. In the right-hand column of the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org, you find the daily news roundup, which I write, and then the show, which, I put out 3 times a week. On the show, I update current events. And so if you're a new listener to the show, it'd probably be helpful to subscribe. That way you get every episode and you get the most out of the show. Last, if you want to be a donor to the show, you go to patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. If you get $5 a month, you get it on the monthly live stream. So you can either come join me and chat like Libertarian Institute blogger Stephen Waskow has a few times, or you could just post questions and I'll give them preference either in the Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus or at patreon.com. This month's live stream is going to be Wednesday, August 28th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. I know that's the day this show is being published. I probably didn't do as great of a job this month of, kind of publicizing this ahead of time, but I've been very busy doing a lot of work, with my daily news roundup at antiwar.com. So make sure you're checking out that site. As I'm now assisting in putting together the viewpoints there, and just have some stuff, personally going on, moving, traveling, all that kind of summer stuff. But I've done a pretty good job of getting the show out to you guys, so I hope you're enjoying it. And if you got any feedback, always let me know. Probably the best place to do that is on Facebook in the private group Foreign Policy Focus. All right, enough with the intro. Need to talk some news here. Twitter announced a new policy that seems very much in favor of censoring the opinions that are promoted by people other than the U.S. government and U.S. government-funded organizations. And so, on one hand, Twitter announced a policy of no longer allowing state media organizations to be able to advertise on their site, which I guess is something that if Twitter wanted to do as a private company, not saying it should be regulated against. However, the problematic part of this policy comes with this very strange new thing where they're still going to allow taxpayer-funded, so government-funded, sites to be able to advertise. So this is going to stomp out the views of, Chinese media, RT, stuff like that, but still allow Western funded organizations, think BBC or something like that, to be able to advertise on their site. Now, Twitter also announced that they're getting some determination deciding which group is which and who should be allowed to advertise on their site or not. And many of these institutions are government funded institutions, and not Russian or Chinese funded government, just to be clear, but Western organizations. And so I'm going to link to an article in the show notes page that goes through Twitter's statement, breaks it down, what the problems with it are, and importantly, it discusses some of the groups that are funded by the U.S. government and also advising Twitter on what to put on their site. And I think the one highlighted is Freedom House. I want to add here that I'm not saying that the government should or anybody should force Twitter to allow RT to advertise on their site. However, with the standard being set by U.S. funded groups, Twitter should be aware that they're essentially just promoting the U.S. government line. A lot of people end up getting their news on these social networking sites like Facebook and Twitter. And so if the content being put in front of their faces more often is only the Western government's media and not, potentially the media of foreign governments, then that's problematic. If it was even in just neither group, anything funded by a government anywhere, whether it's taxpayer funded, which I don't know, is the Russian government not funded by taxes unlike the U.S. government? I mean, it all seems like the same thing to me, right? The government steals the money from someone and then spends it. Same thing with China. But, now they're not allowed to advertise. So I would get rid of all of it. But if you're not going to get rid of all of it, you should get rid of none of it and allow everybody to put their word out there. Again, I say that as a consumer who, I've taken Twitter polls and I've told them in like their surveys or whatever that this is the way I felt, that it should either be an open network or, if you're going to have some censorship, don't have U.S. funded government agencies, or organizations like Freedom House being the groups to do that. So again, that article linked in the show notes page. Want to talk Russia and missile tests. The first story is by Scott Ritter in the American Conservative. This was a fantastic write-up linked in the show notes page. Maybe a little too technical at times, to share with just, your random cousin who's not really interested in military affairs, because what Scott Ritter does, but I think in a very simple way, probably the best way possible, goes through and kind of says that the allegation here is that Russia was testing a missile with some kind of nuclear engine, and it turns out that wasn't the case, and the missile they were actually testing was using nuclear batteries, I guess, to keep the fuel at the proper temperature. The easiest way to do that is with a nuclear battery. And so when the missile malfunctioned and exploded, it set off and destroyed at least one of those batteries. And, Ritter goes down and explains, because of this nuclear composition, we know it was the battery and not one of these other rockets. And so that's, he just sets the record straight, does a beautiful job of it. And know that if people are out there saying, oh, Russia's testing this new nuclear missile, well, that's not really what's going on. Now, the U.S. is testing some land-based cruise missiles, and Russia fears that they could be used to carry nuclear weapons. And these are in violation, or would be in violation, of the INF Treaty. This is the Intermediate Range Forces Treaty that was vacated by the United States earlier in 2019 and officially died just a few weeks ago. It banned nuclear-based ground missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers, but just did a really good job of destroying an entire class of kind of nuclear-type weapons in an entire battlefield Europe for them. And so, from what they say, this was important in, I guess, somewhat increasing the amount of time. So you put something up on the radar that looks like nuclear missiles coming over the horizon. Well, if the range for those is 6,000 kilometers, you have a hell of a lot more time to decide what decision to make, rather than if the missiles may be being fired from Eastern Europe into France or something like that, where it's a few thousand kilometers at the most. Putin said that Russia will respond in kind, and if the U.S. is testing these type of missiles, Russia will as well. The U.S. missile test, I guess, it doesn't seem very sophisticated to me. I'm very curious as to why they did it, because it seems like they just took one of the missile launchers off of the ships, put it on land, and stuck one of the cruise missiles in it and fired it. And this is something that I'm assuming if they could do it on the ship, then it can't be that hard to, translate it to land, where you would seem to have more constants, if nothing else. And now maybe I'll read something that'll explain why the U.S. seems to be flaunting the violations of the INF Treaty, or maybe they're just looking to provoke Russia into carrying out a similar test, and that way John Bolton and the rest of the hawks in the administration could be, oh my God, look at how dangerous Russia is getting. Look at the tests they're carrying out, when they're only in response to the American tests. But because Americans generally don't care about what weapons tests are going on in the United States and never see them as a threat, and would never perceive that anybody else would think that those tests are a threat, when Russia and Russians and Chinese and I'm sure Iranians and North Koreans, all when the U.S. tests a weapon, they say, oh, well, that's a threat. And they're probably a hell of a lot more close than when they test weapons in determining if it's an actual threat that will attack them. So, this seems to be just another one of those problems with vacating these nuclear treaties. You end up in arms race type situation, wasting billions of dollars that preferably would just be left with the people, but if, taken from us anyways, could be spent on a hell of a lot better things than bombs and, just welfare checks to war makers, Lockheed Martin and the rest of those very rich people who continue to make money while we suffer. All right, Hong Kong protests. From what I saw, they became more violent over this past weekend, and that is a concern. Now, Moon of Alabama noted in the past that these protests are student, centered. That's kind of the backbone of the protest movement right now, and seems to be the most, I don't know if the word radical is too unfair to use, but the most provocative, definitely, faction of these protesters are the students, and classes will resume within the next week. And so he's saying that he thinks that'll really start to fizzle out the protests. But this past weekend, at least from all the footage I saw, it seemed to be the most violent weekend of the protest. Now, I'm not one to ever take the side of police officers, and certainly the cops are not the solution or the victims here. But as far as aggression goes, it looks like the people are giving as good as they were getting. only a dozen or so arrests were made. The police say 21 officers were injured. One shot was fired in the air to ward off. Apparently 6 officers drew their guns. And so I will say, compared to what American police do, these Hong Kongers police seem to be showing a decent amount of restraint. And again, I don't like the cops and I don't want to take their side here. But if you're looking at this, you're looking at the source of aggression, it doesn't seem to every time be the police officers, rather, at least instigators within that protest movement. And who knows, they, could be Chinese spies looking to provoke a fight between the protesters and the police. But just observations of what's happening, I want to point all that out. The police are deploying rubber-coated steel bullets, and, I've talked about the problem with those a lot in the Palestinian, how the Israelis use them against the Palestinians, breaking bones and nearly killing or killing people with them. Again, a dozen or so rounds were fired, or I should say, I think more. I think it was 50 or 60. And then 200 or so tear gas canisters were then deployed as well. Thomas Harrington, who does really good work on Catalonia, chimed in on Hong Kong just a little bit. And at the top of his article, which he really takes in the direction of Catalonia, and I think he uses Hong Kong and more as just kind of a hook to get people to kind of remember that, the oppression of the Catalans continues to happen in Spain. But he says, this is probably a protest that has some sincere elements who oppose the Chinese state, but there are other instigators and agitators, and no doubt the U.S. has some role and involvement in that. Many of the Hong Kong protest leadership live in or associate a lot with Washington. There are groups that I believe money channeled through the National Endowment for Democracy have gone to Hong Kong. And so, we've seen it in Eastern Europe and in other places around the world, how these type of organizations have launched color-coded revolutions and overthrown governments. I will say that, this may be stopped short of some of the more blatant color-coded revolutions. I'm not sure how much success the U.S. actually has or how much money they've thrown into, and this compares to how rich the people and groups in Hong Kong are. And maybe that's one difference, is that $2 million in Hong Kong probably doesn't go quite as far as it would in some other countries that are, not quite as wealthy. Either way, so I would stop short calling it a color-coded revolution, at least from all the evidence I've seen at this point. Next time World Porter's on the show, I'll talk to him about some really good research that he did going through and trying to document all the cases of the U.S. giving money to Hong Kong protest movements. There is this interesting character involved here. I believe his name is Jason Lee. And I talked about him on the last show, how he runs this Chinese news organization and how it's been used to, kind of spread anti-Chinese, mainland Chinese sentiment and all his ties with the U.S. government. Anyways, the Thomas Harrington article ran on antiwar.com. I'll link to that one in the show notes page. I'll also link to this article by Lyle Goldstein, who was recently a guest on the Scott Horton show and writes some pretty good stuff for the National Interest. So, if you read the National Interest and you come across the byline, Lyle, L-Y-L-E, Goldstein, make sure you check out his work. Most of it seems pretty good to me. This particular article was how, rather than Catalonia, drawing similarities with that, drawing similarity between Hong Kong and then the Maidan, the 2014 regime change protest in Ukraine that certainly ended up with a lot of U.S. backing and support. So, if somebody asks you if the U.S. is involved, you say at least a little bit, and, it probably doesn't help ease tensions at all that, U.S. politicians and stuff are weighing in on Twitter. Not that it's necessarily an act of violence for the president to say, hey, some protesters are being suppressed somewhere. But with the U.S. track record of overthrowing so many governments and, carrying out so many regime change operations, the U.S. signaling they may have a target on your back or saying that you suppress protesters because that's one of the excuses very regularly used to justify a regime change, that China or the Hong Kong government may feel like it has a little bit of a target on its back here. A couple other things I've learned about Hong Kong recently that I just thought would be important to share. The UK had a long lease on Hong Kong, territory they seized during the Opium Wars, and that's in the early 20th century, I believe, late 19th century. They get a 99-year lease, It expires right at the 1990s now. And at the time, I guess the UK was looking to extend the lease and mainland China said no. And the UK realized and understood, well, there's really nothing we could do to defend Hong Kong if China just decides to take it. I guess the other, part of historical stuff here that's important is there is like the main island of Hong Kong Island, but there's a lot of other territory around it. And so it looks a lot smaller if you just see Hong Kong Island than it actually is. There's a lot more territory there. The other important thing is that I think the Chinese government has started to be blamed for the situation in Hong Kong, I guess, being tough. I mean, I certainly think the average Hong Konger lives a better life than the average person in China, but kind of like the U.S. and, I'm struggling and declining middle class here. Maybe same situation in Hong Kong. Part of this is apparently because China has opened up more. And so there was a long time where Hong Kong maintained a special status where, one government, two systems was the tagline there. And essentially they're able to retain their capitalist system, but were a part of China. So I guess if anybody really wanted to do business with China, the best way to do that was to bring whatever they're selling into Hong Kong and then throw it to China from there. But now Shanghai or wherever else just hates all that. And so being in Hong Kong is a lot less advantageous. I guess some of their manufacturing has left and it's no longer really an important gateway to the rest of China. There's a lot of other options. There's also a lot of corruption in the Hong Kong government. Joanne Leome, the Around the Empire podcast, frequent guest of this show, did a pretty good episode on it. I'm going to link to that in the show notes page. Heavy show notes page for you today, guys, but I think it'll be a really good one to make sure you go to the Libertarian Institute for. And the interview just exposes all of the corruption in Hong Kong and how the government is really, I guess, preventing new development from happening. And when they do, they only give it to certain land developers and they're just skyrocketing the rates because they essentially have like a corrupt monopoly mafia on the whole system. And a lot of people are apparently living in like 300 and 350 square foot apartments. Has to be absolutely miserable for a lot of people there. And, you start to imagine why people end up on the street protesting against the government. But we got to keep an eye on how much the U.S. is co-opting that movement. On Ukraine, interesting situation there where John Bolton traveled to that country, and anywhere John Bolton goes, trouble could start. That's definitely a place in the world you don't want trouble to start because that's trouble coming with Russia. And so I will definitely have my eye on Ukrainian news in the next couple of days. Is the government there doing anything more hawkish because they're getting certain guarantees by John Bolton? Is Donald Trump now talking about Crimea or something like that? I'm going to keep my eye on that. Maybe a peace deal here with the Taliban. Reading Jason Ditz at antiwar.com saying that they're receiving reports that a peace deal was agreed to by the U.S. and the Taliban and it'll be implemented in the coming days, or I guess officially announced publicly in the coming days. Hopefully, this is the case and we could start to get out of this whole thing. But, I'm not going to say too much about this till I hear about what the agreement is because at this point, like I said, I just have that one report. At the G7 talks, which ended, a couple big notes there is Russia was not allowed back into what was the G8. And so, that's tough for diplomacy, but, there's more talk of it every year. And it seems that some of the countries in the organization, and I'll talk about that next, maybe a little less completely influenced by the United States. So in the hopes that diplomacy increases with Russia being invited back to the G8, maybe in the next couple of years, but who knows where tensions go in what direction, especially if Trump wins the next election. I'm sure Russia will be blamed again. So proof that the U.S. may have a little bit less influence over the G7 is the French President Macron invited the Iranian Foreign Minister Zaif, who was recently sanctioned by the United States, to come to the G7 and meet with him. The statements from that meeting seemed positive, but afterwards Rouhani clarified that there will be no meeting because it would just be a photo op until U.S. sanctions on Iran are lifted. The Iranian super oil tanker, the Grace 1, has been released by Gibraltar, and Iran announced it had gotten rid of its oil. Don't know where or to who, how it sold it off, but I guess it's very easily possible to, transfer oil from one ship to the other at sea. I'm sure the U.S. has intelligence on who this all went to. It'll be interesting to see if any sanctions come of it. Iran has reported to have, sent a warship to escort this supertanker to its next stop. All right, updates on Syria. Turkish President Erdogan met with Russian President Putin. They discussed the situation in the Idlib province of Syria. This is the kind of northern area of Syria that is west of the Euphrates River. It's the last pocket of this part of the country that is not controlled by Assad. The main rebel faction there is HTS, which was once al-Nusra, which is basically just Al-Qaeda in Syria, along with other rebel factions that may be less jihadists, and then Turkish soldiers who hold observation points around Idlib. Almost a year ago now, and maybe it has been a year, Turkey agreed to this ceasefire where they were supposed to withdraw the Al-Qaeda fighters and all heavy weaponry from the front lines, and then I guess look for a way to, reintegrate this part of the country peacefully or have some kind of power sharing agreement, some kind of peaceful resolution. Turkey was never able to hold up on its promises, and the Al-Qaeda affiliate continued to attack the Syrian government until this year. The Syrian government started their offensive against Al-Qaeda in that province and have started to take significant territory, including the town of Khan Sheikhoun, once the site of an alleged chemical weapons attack that is probably very familiar to this audience, as Will Porter has come on the show several times to debunk all the lies about that chemical weapons attack. But that was taken from the Al-Qaeda rebels, so that was an important gain by the Syrian government, and it looks like they'll continue to make some progress against the rebels in Idlib. After the meeting between Erdogan and Putin, Erdogan said that some agreements were made. It didn't seem to me like there was some kind of grand bargain or another peace deal put in place, but there are Turkish soldiers, I guess, at these observation points within the Idlib province, and I'm sure Turkey is, because it doesn't want to get involved in the shooting war with Assad. Now, Turkey also has issues in Syria on the east side of the Euphrates River. On this side, you find the U.S.-backed Kurdish forces who hold territory all the way up to the border with Turkey in northeastern Syria. And this has long been a problem for Turkey, who is dealing with and oppressing their own Kurdish population, which has an insurgency movement that is very closely tied to the Syrian Kurdish movement. There's been fighting between the U.S.-backed Syrian Kurds and Turkish soldiers. Turkey has reported on several occasions that they neutralized Syrian Kurds and reported that Turkish soldiers have been killed. At least I haven't read any casualty figures coming from the Syrian Kurds, but the fact that the numbers are pretty balanced coming from the Turkish side makes me somewhat believe that they're probably accurate. Turkey has been demanding, and I guess, for the U.S. to be the ones to enforce, and since the Syrian Kurds there are our proxy force, a 20-mile safe zone along the border between Turkey and Syria, so goes 20 miles deep into Syria, where there would be no armed Kurds. This crosses through a lot of heavily populated Kurdish territory, and somebody said that the majority of the Syrian Kurds live in this area, and so that would be a real concession for them all to disarm. Today, I read a report in Reuters that says the Kurds agreed to a buffer zone that was 3 miles at some points and 9 miles at others, and everything else is in between. We'll see what Turkey makes public statements about here, if they agree to that or not. It's certainly not even half of what they were asking for. Generally, Erdogan hasn't seemed to me to be somebody that would settle and one of the more reckless leaders, and I would expect that, he increases demands to 20 kilometers, and, depending on who enforces this, we could see some more skirmishes between the U.S. NATO allies Turkey and our proxy force, the Syrian YPG. All right, got to talk about these Israeli airstrikes here. They happen across the Middle East. Iraq was hit, and this was a story that comes, I think, from a U.S. government source that says, a few months ago, Israel bombed Popular Mobilization Forces. These are the Shia militia, in part backed by the Iranians, and the U.S. gave them air support in the fight against ISIS. Tens of thousands of these militiamen exist across Iraq, and, according to Israel, they're just an Iranian proxy force. Well, anyways, Israel bombed one of their arms depots and has carried out several strikes against them recently. And so this was some big news, and it's certainly, from Israel's point of view, and what they say publicly, a strike against Iran. Israel has carried out hundreds of airstrikes in Syria during the war, always claiming to target Hezbollah or the IRGC or missile sites, missile factories or something like that. This time, they apparently carried out a targeted strike, killing a few Iranian soldiers. Israel claims they are from the Quds Force, which would be the IRGC's international branch. Israel also carried out 2 drone strikes, and I guess these were explosive drones, targeted a neighborhood in Beirut. The first one failed. The second one caused an explosion. I don't believe anybody died. The Lebanese president, so Lebanon has an interesting power sharing agreement where there are Sunnis who hold the prime minister, and that is Hariri, famous for being kidnapped by Mohammed bin Salman. There is the Speaker of the Parliament, and this is a position held by the Hezbollah leader Nasrallah. And then there is the president, who I think has probably the most authority as far as, what's constitutionally given. And that is, I think his first name is Michael Aoun, A-O-U-N. And the president there, and this is, I believe, a Mennonite Christian or some kind of Christian, that this is like a declaration of war. And so Lebanon is taking this very seriously. As you can see, Israel is acting very provocative, carrying out another strike in Lebanon. This one by, I think, somewhere in southern Lebanon, and it was a Palestinian office. Now, I will say the strikes in Syria, Israel admits to. The Iraq ones confirmed by the U.S. I trust that Israel was behind the drone strikes in Beirut because the Christian president's the one who made the statement saying it was an act of war, so he must have pretty good information that Israel was behind it. And then the Palestinian one was a statement put out with the Palestinians, but look at the other action in the Middle East, you think, yeah, it's probably right that this was Israel. Israel has also recently made threats against the Houthis. So what is going on here? Well, elections are coming up in Israel, and as we know in the United States of America, nothing, creates some fervor for nationalism in the hometown, kind of the good guy, and that's the right-wing guy, and that's right now Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. And so as the sitting prime minister with a lot of power, it's not surprising that he's looking to ramp up a little hostility with his neighbors. Now, I don't know if he actually wants a war. Maybe that's an overstatement. I think he would rather just escalate tensions to the point where it looks like everybody's pretty close to war, but at the end of the day, it wouldn't be a good thing for Israel for a war to break out between Israel and the target of all this by Israel, which is Iran. If you look at the people targeted, the Palestinians, Lebanon, the Quds Force in Syria, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, potentially the Houthis in Yemen. These are all, quote unquote, Iranian-backed forces. I mean, all these groups, at least nominally, are supported by Iran, but all to limited and varied degrees, and certainly not as much as the U.S. Supports Israel every year. This is probably the most concerning thing going on to me right now because, a miscalculation at this point could spark a much wider conflict. And it's very hard to see how Israel gets in any kind of shooting war with Iran that doesn't involve Hezbollah launching attacks against Israel, and then the United States, in some capacity, at least against the Iranian proxy forces, if not with Iran itself involved in a shooting war in the Middle East as well. So, it's extremely dangerous. You see all the problems here. My guess is that this is because those elections are coming up in Israel. Netanyahu is struggling for his political life. First round of elections doesn't have enough votes to form a government. And it seems that he's looking to appeal to the far right. And that this is where he thinks he's going to make up his margins that he needs. And the more right-wing you seem, you guys seem anti-Arab, anti-Iran. And so by carrying out these airstrikes, maybe gain, some good threats from the, different leaders of the Arab countries, Assad, the Ayatollah, Rouhani, al-Houthi. These could be things that increase kind of the nationalist feelings of the Israeli people and lead them to reelecting Netanyahu. So I think that's the calculation that he's making right now. This is why we have this problem. At the same time, it's possible that the other countries understand this, and hopefully Israel doesn't do anything too obnoxious and the other countries don't react in a way that starts a shooting war. All right, everybody. Again, live stream is tonight, so that will be Friday's show. Hopefully I'll be back on Monday. I am doing some moving, so not sure how good my internet will be working all this at that point, but the Monday show is late. That's why. Really excited to be doing the show and keeping up with everything. I hope you all are enjoying it. Make sure you can give me feedback at the private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus, Twitter at KYAAALE, patreon.com/Foreign Policy Focus, libertarianinstitute.org. The show is also republished on checkpointasia.net. Make sure you check that out. It's from by former guest of the show, Marko Marjanovic. He does a great job there. And that's it. I'll talk to you next week.